This week's lesson, the seventh lesson, we turned the page kind of from local and individual and theoretical to global and maybe in some ways practical looks at inequality. Much bigger scale now. We're concerned with how things work in the globe, and this week we're concerned with the theory of dependency theory. And dependency theory is important probably at this point for being the ancestral form of several other important things: modernization and global world systems theory that we'll go into next week. And in dependency theory, you have the origins of some thinking about the relationship between basically the rich nations of the world and the poorer nations of the world. And these ideas got started back in the 1960s, you know, when the whole world was in turmoil and there was a lot of original thinking going on. And in that original formulation of dependency theory, there was the idea of the core economies, mostly European, American, and Japanese, and outside of those core economies are peripheral economies that serve in supporting roles to the core economies. And this was originally done at a very simplistic level where the people in Europe and the United States and Japan held all the cards, and all of the other people in other parts of the world had to kind of line up and do as best they could after that. And so those ideas were developed in the 60s, and then kind of after the 60s, when the developmental world started to go along and be powers in its own right, then social scientists in the developing countries and activists worldwide said, "Oh no, that's really horrible. It's fraught with stereotypes and all kinds of problems." And so what was initially kind of accepted and kicked around a little bit after the 60s and into the 70s declined in credibility and was basically discarded for a time. But then some scholars began to pick it up in the 80s and add some nuance to those definitions of core and periphery and all of that sort of thing. And so then there was a revitalization of the idea in the 1980s, and in the readings this week in Weibel's article, you'll see some of the history of that and get some thoughts on how that model can be improved and made more workable. Weibels is particularly interested in defining some of the terms in the dependency theory, like enclaves and that sort of thing, which he felt were so ill-defined even in the 1980s reformulations that the model couldn't really be tested. And I want you to think about this idea of testing the model and defining of terms and everything, particularly as you're reading what Weibels thinks are the solution to this, because he's saying, well, what is lacking at this point is that there's no way to link the idea of, say, enclaves to the people who are running things on the ground in various parts of the world, and so there isn't any way to link their motivations to what it means to become an enclave and find out what kinds of economies become enclaves and what kinds of economies become more independent players. And you might think about whether that's really a workable scheme or not in terms of the way we usually think about theory and modeling, because theory and modeling are about abstracting. So where do you cut the line between getting too particular and getting too theoretical? And so that should be your line of concern here. The other article takes an interesting point of view that we don't see very often on modernization. Modernization has to do with contrasting points of in the history of economies, traditional part of the economy and the modernized part of the economy. And of course, traditional economies are basically Neolithic and pre-industrial villages and towns, but the modern economies are the industrial economies. Well, that started at different times all over the world in the last 300 years, and so each one has a different starting point and a different ending point. And some of the original crippling assumptions of dependency theory is that basically the European path to industrialization in terms of politics and economy and resources and everything was kind of assumed to be the way it was everywhere. But as third world social scientists become involved in this, where they say, no, 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 there are any number of ways that, any number of paths, as they're called, from traditional to modern societies, and all of these things need to be given due consideration. Now, what's kind of engaging about this, taking this Chinese point of view, it's obviously a factor, a product of the Communist Central Party ruling committee in China. And ordinarily in the West, these things are regarded with some suspicion, you know, the acts of dictators and autocratic system and blocking of information flow and things like that. But in a world where a lot of the industrial activity is going on in China, well, we have to kind of sit down and soberly think about how we engage these people. And probably one of the great lessons that I had in this was having a woman, being acquainted with a woman from China, a student, and she helped me with some classes and things, and I got to know her pretty well, and it was clear from her point of view that she didn't, I don't suppose that she had any misconceptions about China being a democracy or anything, but on the other hand, she thought that the Chinese people do have a say in what's going on in China through their Communist Party congresses and things like that. And in fact, all the history of China has been kind of like this. When people, when the elites in Beijing got too uppity, the monks in the hinterlands started marches to Beijing, and not infrequently the leadership in Beijing was overthrown. And so taking those lessons from the past, there is a certain amount kind of indirect democracy that goes on there. And as you'll see, the article by Chow is very idealistic in terms of who's going to be taking care of the people and things like that. And I guess one of our critical jobs is to figure out whether the press is reporting what's going on in China accurately, and whether there's a certain amount of control as possible over the elites. We think in terms of the dirty air in Beijing, but is that all that's going on there, and will those things eventually get cleaned up to the betterment of the populace, or I guess you would just say that it's a stage that they're passing through to get to a better life for the populace in general.